Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes, and today we'll be diving into a discussion on the ongoing unrest in the African nation of Mozambique. At least 21 people have been killed in Mozambique since Monday in violent clashes. Police officers and protesters have been involved. The unrest stems from allegations that the recent presidential election was rigged by the ruling Frelimo party. Interior Minister Pascoal Ronda confirmed the deaths but did not provide further details on the circumstances. Among those killed were 2 police officers, and authorities have made 71 arrests in connection with the violence. Human rights organisations have condemned Mozambique's security forces for their harsh response to the protests, which included the use of live ammunition and rubber bullets. More than 100 people have died in protests since the election in October. Tensions escalated further this week after Mozambique's top court upheld the election results favouring Frelimo's candidate Daniel Chapo. His party has been in power since the country became independent from Portugal in 1975. Today we're joined by 4 guests. We have Ambassador Baswati Mukherjee, former diplomat. We have Gautam Mukherjee, a senior journalist. We have Rabinder Sachdev, foreign affairs expert, and retired Major General A.K. Sawach, who is a defence expert. Major General Sawach, I'd like to come to you first. What we've seen in Mozambique over the past 24 to 48 hours, riots, we've seen fires, we've seen looting. But in terms of the response from the security forces and from the police, do you think that matches up with the level of protests that we've seen?
You know, the problem as far as Mozambique is concerned is that there is already an unrest in Mozambique because there is unemployment, there is a lot of poverty. There is also insurgency which is backed in the southern part of Mozambique by the Islamic State. So the situation was as it is very critical. And this election which has taken place in October, they have been considered to be fake. And there are a lot of, one can say with conviction as the things that are coming, has taken place which are not to the liking of the people of Mozambique. They feel that the election have been manipulated and there are a lot of rigging which has taken place, and they were protesting against that. And Daniel Chapo of Frelimo party, who was elected or who was declared winner, you know, the opposition party has gone into Supreme Court and challenged that election. Unfortunately, the court has held that the election of Daniel Chapo is valid. And that has triggered off the basically this protest. And while controlling this protest, the police has used not minimum force but the maximum force. And they have used a number of weapons, they have used tear gas, and unfortunately more than 20 people have been killed. And the situation has become very, very critical now in Mozambique, and due to which even the South Africa, which is a bordering country, are feeling this unrest may go towards South Africa also. They are trying to now close their border. There is a big, big problem coming in Mozambique. The people are on the street. There is a civil war type situation which has come, and police is unable to basically control. Whether they call the security forces, whether they call army, the time will only tell. But as on today, one can say with what is happening there, a country which once upon a time ruled by Portugal till 1975 is in a bad state. There is a chaos and confusion. The people are on the street. They are not ready to listen to what the government is saying, and the police is having a hard time. The opposition party, who is saying that they are ready for talk but not with the ruling party, they are ready to talk only to the international media, and then only there can be mediation. So overall, one can say why the situation has gone out of control is that the police have not acted in a professional manner. They have used maximum force and they have not able to handle it diplomatically, and now the thing looks to be out of hand, and there is a civil war type of scenario going in Mozambique.
Ambassador Baswati Mukherjee, I'd like to come to you next as a former diplomat. In terms of the claims that this election has been rigged or hasn't been presented fairly, we're looking at a 75% vote share with the ruling party. But how much instability can be caused by an election that is claimed to be false? There are, of course, independent people who have been there who have said that the counting and certain other aspects have been wrong. But I want to look at the sort of hotbed of frustration that's been created here and what that impact can be to a nation, whether it's Mozambique or another.
Well, there's a double narrative here which is puzzling. First of all, the opposition candidate, he is actually not in Mozambique, and it's not clear how he plans to install himself as the head of state of Mozambique on 15th of January, as he claims. Secondly, the the highest constitutional court has upheld the election, and the election observers who have been sent, none of them have said clearly that the election was unfair or that there was so much rigging that the result of the election can be disputed. So under those circumstances, you have a situation where the highest constitutional court has ruled in favor of Daniel Chapo, who is supposed to take over from the incumbent who has served his full 2 terms under the constitution of Mozambique. You have a situation of civil war, as has been pointed out by my co-panelists, in the southern part, where there are those who want Mozambique to become an Islamic jihadi state. This appears to be an increasing trend worldwide, and it would be extremely detrimental to South Africa, to Mauritius and others who are close neighbors of Mozambique. Mozambique also has a sizable Indian population, an Indian diaspora. So all these developments are being watched very anxiously by those who have been settled there and who were actually taken as indentured labor and stayed on, and who have made their business in Mozambique, etc. The use of force in a civil war, as has been pointed out by my co-panelists, is governed by certain strict rules and regulations, one of them being never to use live ammunition. What caused the death was the use of live ammunition. Even when live ammunition is used to control communal riots, for example, first 3 warnings are given. There's a training given to police officers. You need, for instance, in India, you need the approval of the district magistrate. And then you never shoot to kill. You shoot on the ground to keep the crowd at bay. These are called measures which are used for crowd control, but without causing any fatalities. Unfortunately, this was not the case. And when live ammunition is used and when there are deaths, then an inflammatory situation gets further inflamed. So it would be for the authorities in Mozambique to decide how to take this further. I don't think the situation is good for direct talks. So maybe they could ask for the African Union to mediate. That is usually the case in Africa. In such situations, they ask the AU, which is based, I think, in Ethiopia, if I'm not mistaken, in Addis Ababa, to send a delegation who could mediate between the 2 sides. I think this would be a situation where African Union mediation would be much more acceptable than, let's say, European Union mediation or the UN, because in all former colonized states, there is always the suspicion of the heavy hand of the ex-colonizer, in this case, Portugal. So I think African Union mediation might be the best way out.
Robinda Sachdev, I'd like to come to you as a foreign affairs expert. Looking at what can be done, we of course have the ruling government, we have the protesters and the opposition, but there is, as has been mentioned already, there is a Islamist uprising within Mozambique. So what is the dynamic within the country so our audience can understand a little bit more? We're not looking at one party versus another. This is a nation which is divided, a nation which is facing financial difficulty, but also one that is facing uncertainty.
Thank you so much. I think both my esteemed previous panelists have very well painted the landscape which is out there. So probably I'll be just adding a few bits around those aspects itself. The first thing to note is that, on the one hand, overall, we can also imagine and understand anti-incumbency. This party has been in power ever since the independence of the state, right? Close to 50 odd years, since 1975. It started out as more of a left party, but then over time it has, moved on to as a center-left party in terms of ideology, we were to say. The opposition party, on the other hand, is definitely to the right. Okay, in the overall ideological spectrum, if we were to look. That's one. Secondly, so anti-incumbency, given the factors which are out there, combined various factors, economic growth, economic development, unemployment, and such issues. And then, of course, combined with insurgencies, I understand, I think it's in the north, where the Islamic insurgents are there, ISIS and all, and that kind of, leads, if not to some, Mozambique has more or less fair relations with all its neighbors. It's not that, Mozambique is in sharp disputes with any of its neighbors. With Tanzania, yes, there's an issue, but with Tanzania, the issue is because of the insurgency. Mozambique claims that these guys, they get refuge in Tanzania and then come over the border, and Tanzania denies that. So that's one little dispute. There is a dispute of water sharing also with one of its neighbors. But beyond that, it seems that, the overall policy, foreign policy, we were to say, international relations in the region for Mozambique are okay. But what seems to be happening is that the country is imploding inside. And these factors, given the numbers which are there, the elections which were disputed, which were held in October, the ruling party candidate, Chapo, he claimed, or they got 80% of the votes and 20% were for the opposition leader. The matter went to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court looked into it and said, okay, yes, there was some discrepancy, so he did not get 80% of the vote, he got 75% of the vote, right? And the opposition guy, yes, not 20, but maybe 25. So that's hardly any, relief from the point of view of what the opposition was seeking. So it seems if the vote is genuine, there's a huge gap, right? If this leader has 75% of the vote and the opposition 25, even if the opposition is vocal, that means they do not have the majority. But on the other hand, looking at what's happening on the streets, it seems that the opposition definitely has more support and more numbers than the 25% which are being attributed to it. So it could perhaps, result in a prolonged status quo of, political instability. So that's one, one outcome, or if not one outcome, one future we could see in the short term at least. And or oblique, as Ambassador mentioned, the African Union could be involved to mediate in some efforts. But I think perhaps we are headed for some time of definitely political instability, some violence on the streets. If it tones down, that's good. Or if it keeps on, if the anger on the streets keeps growing, then things will get even more intense.
I want to look at the anger on the streets and the anger amongst the people of Mozambique. Gautam Mukherjee, a senior journalist, I want to bring it back to the people and speak to you about that. In terms of any potential escalation, any further nights of protests which could be deadly or violence, what impact will this have on the people who are just looking to go about their day-to-day lives, who ultimately have accepted the election? And for those who are feeling strongly enough to do this action, what do you think their next steps could be in terms of an escalation further than the riots?
Well, I think, the entire thing does smack of rigging and vote manipulation on the part of the ruling party. 75, 80, 90% vote shares are, routinely trotted out in countries where an incumbent is in a position of power and in a position to rig the elections and possibly also manipulate the institutions like the courts. This is therefore spilling over on the street, where people are protesting because of maladministration as much as the vote outcome. The vote outcome does not affect day-to-day lives of ordinary people, as per your question, but if they are suffering in terms of unemployment, high prices, law and order situations, and so on, they're liable to protest. And there are obviously people, the Islamists, who are quite willing to fan the flames and provide some support in a covert manner for this to keep boiling, because they have an agenda in the unrest to try and enlarge their influence, not only in Mozambique, but also into the neighboring countries, where they, as one of the panelists pointed out, they run across to Tanzania and come back. So they have their networks and are trying to exploit the situation. So the government, on the one hand, is trying to squash this, possibly in a ham-fisted manner. The opposition is saying this is a false narrative, and we protest it, at least in terms of what they're doing on the road, on the streets. And you've got the insurgents trying to exploit the situation. Now, this is not the only country where this is happening. It's happening in a number of places, and at the bottom of it, and not just in Africa, also in South America, it is Brazil, Colombia. So wherever you've got a economic malaise combined with rigging of elections, you've got this kind of thing. And what happens to the ordinary citizen that is, neither protesting on the road nor part of the insurgency with the Islamists, is he is impacted in a rather helpless capacity.
Major General A.K. Suwach, I'd like to come back to you and look towards now the next steps. We can't, of course, forget the lives that have been lost, both police and civilian, and protesters potentially. But in terms of what the next steps are, if this continues in terms of seeing further unrest, further looting, further protest, what do you think the government response would be? And as a defence expert, where do you see that going? Do you think it could escalate even potentially to some form of civil war, or do you think it will be squashed before that happens?
No doubt, it is going towards civil war. The way things are fanning out, because what is happening is that the opposition has now come in the streets. The people are not ready to go back. The police has acted in high-handedness. Instead of using a minimum force, they have used a maximum force. They have used live rounds, and 21 deaths have taken place. And they know it, that this election is not free. It is been manipulated. There have been rigging which has taken place. No election can have a result which is one-sided. So therefore, the people are not ready to accept the result. And especially the opposition candidate, Mondlane, he is saying that he is not ready to speak to the government. He can only speak to the international fora. So therefore, the problem which is coming is, in case the way the situation is as on today, it can go from bad to worse. And you will find it that the police will use force. There may be requirement of calling the army, and then you will find it that this will fan out to be a total civil war, which is not good for Mozambique. Mozambique is one of the poorest countries of the African continent. Their GDP is one of the lowest, and there is a poverty, there is a unemployment, there is a inflation, and there is also IS, that basically Islamic State insurgency in the southern part. So this is Mozambique, if it's disturbed, if it's unstable, it will impact majority of the countries in the round, including South Africa. So there is a worry, and that's why African Union can play a constructive role. They should get involved in it, and there should be a talk between the ruling party as well as the opposition candidate, and they should find out the solution. If solution is not found well in time, you'll find it the situation going out of hand. As on today, the report which we are getting within 24 hours, there are a lot of cases of looting and arson which has taken place. People are on the streets. They are not ready to accept the result, and they are totally unhappy with the Supreme Court direction or decision given that the election were fair, and the candidate Daniel Chapo is the elected one. They are not ready to accept it. So the point today is some sort of mediation need to be done, and African Union will be the right choice which should come involved in it and try to find out some solution. Some sort of negotiation should take place between the ruling party and the opposition, and they should find a way out. In case it does not come a solution, then you will find it situation going from bad to worse, and there will be more violence. The police will use more, in the sense, firearm, and there will be more casualty, and this will a cascading effect. I suppose the only solution is let international community like African Union get involved, try to find out solution, call from both sides, and some solution which is acceptable to both sides must be found out, because as on today, Mozambique seemingly looks to be in civil war, which will have a tremendous adverse impact not only in Mozambique but the countries which are bordering Mozambique.
Ambassador Baswati Mukherjee, in terms of the potential diplomatic and geopolitical influence in Mozambique, how do you think that that could play out, and how could you bring both sides that are so staunch in their beliefs that one, the election was victorious and was won by a landslide, and the other who are saying that is rigged? How can you find a middle ground between two groups and a divided nation where people are so disagreeing with each other on such a contentious issue?
This is not the first time that such a issue has happened in the African continent. And what the African Union normally does is to send a peacekeeping force composed of Africans, black Africans. When you want to keep order in a colonized country which has been miserably treated by its colonizer, peacekeeping forces have to have the same ethnicity as those who have a problem. That's very important, particularly in Africa. A peacekeeping force, first of all, I think, looking at Mozambique's location on the map, you would find that Mozambique has a border with South Africa, it has a border with Botswana, it has a border with Zimbabwe. So the countries most affected, the neighboring countries, would, I'm sure, if the situation is not brought under control, move the African Union, who would meet in an emergency meeting. There's a set procedure there, and they would inform the head of state of government of Mozambique, the present one, that in the view of the African Union, there is an active threat to the security of the neighboring African countries and threat of huge refugee flows, and that they would like to send a peacekeeping force which could move from Botswana or from South Africa into Mozambique and bring law and order there. And normally the peacekeeping forces of the African Union are extremely efficient in re-establishing law and order. Secondly, I'd like to point out that there are 70,000 persons of Indian origin in Mozambique. There are huge Indian companies in Mozambique. There are huge business relations in Mozambique. There is a huge High Commission of India in Mozambique. So we are vitally affected. We would start repatriating our nationals immediately to South Africa in the event of an active civil war. But I feel a civil war can be avoided because, as I have seen in my 6 years of working in the UN with a Senegalese black African boss, the Africans, because of their horrendous experience of both slavery and colonialism, tend to listen to their brothers and sisters from the continent. So the best bet that we have for peace being restored is to have a black peacekeeping force sent by the African Union at the request of South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, etc., the neighbors, because they face the greatest threat. In fact, the South Africa only has a small border with Mozambique. It's relatively easy to shut it off. Other neighboring countries have much bigger borders. And
yes, sorry to interrupt there. I want to focus in on what a fourth group within Mozambique might do to the stability. Rabinda Sachdev, in terms of the African Union peacekeepers moving into Mozambique, will this throw more uncertainty into the region in terms of, yes, they're peacekeepers, but you're throwing another group into the mix where there's already conflict? Do you think that could be a possibility?
Yeah, very true also. And I think Ambassador Baswati also kind of referred to it. The point is that if the African Union sends a peacekeeping force, does it go with the consent of the ruling party which is there as of now? And if the ruling party, which is as of now, which has claimed to won the election, kind of invites, it'll have to invite probably or give its acquiescence to such a peacekeeping force, would imply that it is not being able to govern the country. So would the ruling party want that? I mean, there would be a huge question out there, because otherwise, how could the peacekeeping force go there? It'll have to be initiated, and Ambassador would, of course, much more know the nuances of how these things are, play out on the ground. It'll have to be invited by the ruling government. Or, yes, in case the civil war situation becomes or the violence becomes such that there is total chaos, total lawlessness, in that case, yes, I do think that definitely, the African neighbors, particularly South Africa, etc., leaders could, gather and send a peacekeeping force. But yes, the question would be a very tedious one. And how much, typically what can peacekeeping forces do? I mean, from what we've seen, let's say the UN peacekeeping forces, right? They have a charter wherein they go and they kind of try and quote unquote implement the peace. They do nothing to, push back whatever is happening. They're not engaging in war on behalf of one side or the other side. Neither are they going out, and let's say eliminating whosoever be the violent or violence offenders. So a peacekeeping force, to what extent can it be effective or play an effective role also, I think would be a question. But yes, that would be one step definitely, which would seem to be out there amongst, there don't seem to be any other options maybe.
Rabinder Sachdev, thank you very much. We're out of time there. Thank you very much also to Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, Gautam Mukherjee, a senior journalist, and also retired Major General AK Sawach. We'll continue to bring you the latest updates from across Mozambique, and we'll bring you the latest debates across NewsX World.